What's your good angle?
We're all good, right, Ricardo?
No, not at all.
No?
All right, so for 2 weeks, I've been stressing about this speech. I've been telling family members about it. I've been telling coworkers about it. And part of the reason why I was excited and both nervous about it was because I love to talk about stuff like this. I'm completely obsessed with it. But the only thing was, I didn't want to tell you guys the truth about this subject and come off as someone who was too heavily involved in conspiracies.
Ricardo,
And
this isn't part of the speech, right? Is this
yeah, it's part of the speech.
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Messing up my flow.
My bad.
But I didn't want to come off as someone who wasn't credible or maybe seemed like they were too involved in sci-fi movies. So I spoke to a coworker of mine. My coworker, his name is John. He's a 73-year-old Polish, sarcastic, hilarious, most down-to-earth, chill guy that I work with at Home Depot. And me and him go on our 15-minute breaks at where we work, and we light a cigarette, and all we talk about is this subject. And I was talking to John and said, John, I can't talk about this in my class because they're gonna look at me like I have 4 heads. And he was like, you know, the younger people of your generation are actually more interested in this subject than you think. And he said, I bet when you ask the question, you're gonna get a better response than you thought. And it's gonna sound ridiculous, but for the past 9 years, this is something that I've been paying very close attention to. And I can tell you guys are like very drawn in right now because you're all locked in on me right now. But just to be clear, this is not something I researched off Google or from watching too many movies or documentaries. And it's honestly hard to find the truth about this subject when there's so much disinformation about it purposely to confuse the people on the truth about this subject. But 9 years ago, I found the truth about this subject, and I've been following it ever since. And I learned all of this information that I'm about to tell you from one person and one person only. It's not something I pieced together in my room, like connecting dots. It's from one man and one man only, and I think it's important that you guys know who this person is too. And I'll get into who that is in a second, but a big reason why I also chose to go along with this speech is because our president a couple weeks ago announced something that actually got my attention really fast because it actually tied into what I'm going to tell you guys about today. He called for the formation of a 6th branch of the military. How many people heard about this? You guys, okay, a couple of people heard about this, right? For those of you who don't know, Donald Trump called for the formation of a 6th branch of the military, and he's going to call it the Space Force. Now, I know it sounds funny, right? It sounds ridiculous, but this is actually something that, according to Vice President Pence, is going to be fully operational by the year 2020. And that's only a year and a month away, so it's not that far. And when he talked about it, I didn't believe it for a second because it directly tied into everything I'm about to talk to you guys about today. And it made me a little bit nervous, and I didn't want to fully believe that this was actually a real thing. But the person that I'm talking about, who I learned all this information from, is Dr. Stephen Greer. How many people know who that is, Dr. Stephen Greer? All right, this is gonna be awesome. So, the man, Dr. Stephen Greer, I'm gonna get into who he is in just a second, but one of the things I wanna talk about is this. Most of you guys are not gonna know what an unacknowledged special access project is. And most presidents are not going to know what that is either. And what Stephen Greer has been talking about for years is what these projects are and why they're so important. And also, he talked about this subject to a lot of important people. And some of those important people were the Director of Central Intelligence, James Woolsey, who was President Clinton's first CIA director. Also the head of the Defensive Intelligence Agency, also the head of Intelligence Joint Staff, also members of the Senate Intelligence Joint Staff, also members of Congress, also members of the European leadership of the Japanese cabinet, as well as briefing packets that he personally briefed President Clinton on and I printed out a document. I'll pass it around later. Not the official document, just a printout. And he also put a briefing together for President Barack Obama on this subject, which I also printed out. And I'll pass it around so you guys could look through it. But I wanted to talk about why Stephen Greer was so important. And also why, when he briefed all of these people that I'm telling you about, were they not, and I quote, surprised that this was true, but uniformly horrified that they were not given access to these projects. So a lot of people in Congress and the military and high-ranking officials, they know about these projects, they just can't get access to them. And I also want to talk about why Stephen Greer has 2 of the largest crowd-funded Netflix documentaries in the history of Netflix. And I didn't learn all this from that documentary. I've been following him for 9 years. But he put those documentaries out not too long ago. And I also want to talk about why his documentaries still to this day stream over 100 times a day. It's a lot of people who are watching him, right? So here's the question that John told me to ask you guys. Who here has ever been sincerely, I mean honestly, interested in the UFO subject? Okay, a couple people. All right, anybody else? Not really, you didn't really care about it? That didn't really intrigue your interest? That's fine, all right? For me, I've always been fascinated with the idea, but I've always been fascinated with the truth about this, and like I said, it's hard to find the truth about this, and if you guys said you don't know who Dr. Stephen Greer is, for the next 5 minutes, I need a huge favor. I need you guys to erase everything that you think you know about this subject, because for the most part, 90% of what you guys have been learning over the years have been purposely constructed in a way to confuse you, so that way you really wouldn't get the truth about this subject. But before I talk about that, here's a quick background on who Dr. Stephen Greer is. Dr. Stephen Greer used to work as the director of emergency medicine in a major hospital in North Carolina. In 1998, he sat his wife down and his 4 children, and he said, I've been doing this part-time for 7 years now. Now I'm gonna do it full-time. And he walked away from all of that money that he was making in emergency medicine to pursue the truth about all of this. And here's the truth. For the past 27 years, Dr. Stephen Greer is the only man who has brought forward over 950 military, government, corporate, intelligence agency members who have been involved in these USAP projects dealing with UFOs, and who have had experiences with these craft and the beings on them. His uncle was the man who helped build the lunar module that helped put Neil Armstrong on the moon. And his uncle had a company called Northrop Grumman, so that's through those family connections he got involved in this subject. Now, here's something that you guys can all look up yourselves. In 2001, there was something called the National Press Club event, right? This event was broadcasted live on multiple news media agencies. The whole world saw it. And it was the largest press club event ever in the history of the National Press Club event. Why? Well, this event was led by Dr. Stephen Greer. One of the problems that they had that day was that some of their streaming systems began to fail because over 800 million people tuned in to watch this event. You can look this up on YouTube, right? So, Dr. Stephen Greer came forward with over 80 military, corporate, intelligence, Congress members who were dealing with who were involved in the secrecy of the UFO subject. Not that they exist and that there's aliens out there and that there's little green men somewhere, but that there was a secrecy built around this subject for many, many years, and the purpose for that secrecy. Also, in 2001, you'll notice that Stephen Greer talks about how there was a danger of the secrecy regarding these UFOs, and also there was a danger to us militarizing space. This was in 2001, and we're 1 year and 1 month away from having this new Space Force. I'm gonna get into the reason why this is important. But each of these witnesses came forward with their documents, their credentials, badges, military ID, background. And what was really interesting about their testimonies was that each one of them came forward and said that under penalty of perjury, they will go into a court of law and state that everything that they are saying to the public right now is true. I don't know how big of a deal penalty of perjury is, but it sounds pretty intense, all right? And it seems like if you're not doing this for profit, why else do you need to feel to come up and make up these stories, all right? So this event picked up really fast. It started to get out to the public. Most of us were young, so we might not remember it, all right? And Congress started to receive hundreds of thousands of letters from people demanding disclosure. Now, this was in 2001, a key year, all right? There's something that happened 3 months later that took away all of this, took away everybody's attention. And I don't know if it coincides with this, but it was something that was catastrophic to the nation. And that something was called 9/11. 9/11 took away everything, the momentum that this was building up, and it took away everybody's attention to the subject. And here we are still in 2018, still without any official disclosure from any president or government or members of Congress or anything like that. Now, here's what I learned over the past 9 years, and everything I'm going to tell you is something I learned from Dr. Stephen Greer. It's not, like I said, it's not something I pieced together. This is his research, but I've been paying very close attention to it for 9 years. So I think, you know, I'm the person who's credible to talk about it because I know so much about it, right? So here's the truth that Dr. Stephen Greer began to teach, was that there are two governments. There's the government of we the people that we elect and who have been appointed. And since World War II, there has evolved a separate government. This separate government desperately needs to be put on a leash and eventually phased out. And that separate government is known as the Deep National Security State of Unacknowledged Special Access Projects. Now, these projects have not been supervised by any president nor Congress by at least 1954. So it's a long time that no one has been watching over these projects because they're so sub-rosa, they're so deep, right? The first thing you need to understand was that in the 1940s in World War II, there were events going on in Europe and the Pacific, mainly in Europe, where there were these things called Foo Fighters. You guys are not familiar with this. Most people are not going to be familiar with this. Sometimes they were fully materialized, so that means they're hard. You can see them materialized. Most of the time, they were an energy field that looked spherical. And they can come down an aircraft, even coming down the center of an aircraft and out the other end. This is the trans-dimensional nature of extraterrestrial spacecraft. This became a huge concern for the Allies, and the Allies dispatched a man named General Jimmy Doolittle. General Jimmy Doolittle was asked to go over to the theater of operations in Europe to find out what the hell these objects were, right? And when he came back to President Roosevelt, he told President Roosevelt, and I'm quoting, "Sir, these are interplanetary vehicles." And so began the modern era of a serious concern on a national security level of UFOs. Now the word Foo Fighter comes from sort of French and German faux for fire, because there were these fiery, luminous objects that had like a bright corona around them. But they would disrupt electromagnetic signals. They would have effects on the gravity around the aircraft, compasses and things of the sort, as the guidance systems. Now, we the Americans and the British thought that this was a secret Nazi weapon. And we found out through our spies that the Nazis thought that this was our secret weapon. And of course, it was neither. But in World War II, because of the type of weapons that were being developed, both by Hitler and both by us, the interstellars, Dr. Stephen Greer calls them, became very concerned with what humans were doing on Earth and the possibility of us terminating life on this planet. Thus, why we had so many sightings in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. There were so many sightings and reports, more than 1,000, way more than that, and from high-ranking people as well. Now, by the time we detonated the first atomic bomb, the facilities at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico were being overflown regularly by UFOs. And they were concerned about what kind of weapons we were developing. Now, when we had the only atomic nuclear bomb squadron in the world that we dropped on Hiroshima, it was developed in New Mexico, and it was tested in White Sands and eventually in Roswell. Most people have heard of Roswell? Anybody heard of Roswell? Okay. Eventually in Roswell, that was the only bomber squadron in the world that had nuclear atomic bombs. Which is why so many people heard about this, which is because they were flying around that specific area because of this reason. We were the only ones that had this type of weaponry. And in 1947, there were 3 flying saucers, discs, that were flying by and doing surveillance of the 509th Bomber Squadron. And we switched on an alleged radar system. These radar systems were said to interfere with their mechanics and caused the crash, which is not true. If you're coming from another star system, another galaxy, and you come to Earth, you're gonna tell me that you can't handle our radar systems and it's messing up with your equipment? That's not true. What actually happened was that these radar domes had something called a scalar longitudinal electromagnetic weapon system, right? Now, when they switched that on, at least 2 of these discs collided. One went northwest of Roswell, and the other impacted near Socorro, New Mexico, and that's actually where they retrieved the bodies. The other one that was just northwest was obliterated into tiny pieces. And Dr. Stephen Greer talked about how there were disclosure witnesses that came forward who have seen the pieces of these craft, and on these pieces, it looked like hieroglyphic writings almost. It was very reminiscent of hieroglyphics. And he smiles and he goes, but you wonder where the pyramids came from. And he just leaves it at that. But here's the reason why I'm telling you guys all this, and I know I went over my time. It's so much energy, it's so much information. But basically, I'm gonna talk about these scalar longitudinal weapons and how, yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up. And how these weapons were deployed in the early 1940s, and they were being experimented on in the early 1900s with T. Townsend Brown, Nikola Tesla. Basically, a scalar longitudinal weapon is, you know how the light here has a wave function and a particle function, and it goes 186,000 miles a second? Scalar longitudinal has no wave. It's just a point. There's 2 particles existing in separate places, and it's just a point and a line, and boom, and that's it. It's very, very high-tech stuff, and they came up with this experimentation in the 1900s, all right? And then they implemented this with the scientists and the crash recoveries that we began to research. Now, I'll skip ahead to the main point of all this because it's just too much information. What they did over the years was something called psychological warfare. Psychological warfare is basically putting out disinformation and hoaxing events to confuse the public on the UFO subject. Now, when they started to study the ET craft, they also started to re-engineer some of them. And these vehicles are called ARVs, Alien Reproduction Vehicles. And what they did throughout the course of time, they staged military abductions on people. So that way people, when they would hear about these abductions, would think that when aliens came down to Earth, this is what they would do to us. They would eat us, they would harm us, they would be violent and aggressive, right? And through ridicule and through movies, we got accustomed to, how many people saw Independence Day? Most people. Dr. Stephen Greer has a disclosure witness that came forward and said that's a script out of the CIA. Now, a disclosure witness that came forward, her name was Carol Roslin. She came forward and spoke to Dr. Stephen Greer. You can watch her interview on SeriousDisclosure.com. She talked about how there was going to be 4 things that was going to happen. One, we were going to have Russian killer satellites, which President Trump and Vice President Pence talked about. 2, terrorists, which we have now today. This interview was 2010, 2013, but she learned about this information from the 1980s. 3 was going to be third world country crazies, we now know about North Korea. 4 was going to be the asteroid defense, and 5 was going to be the hoax alien attack on Earth to stampede us into World War III. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but when I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson, how many people know about Neil deGrasse Tyson? You can watch his interview on CBSN where he talks about the Space Force is not such a bad idea, because for one of the reasons we can use it for is, well, asteroid defense. And when he said that, I go, you cannot be serious right now. I'm almost done. You can't be serious right now. And then on top of that, we have this thing called the Space Force now. Now, I don't know when they're going to pull this whole thing off, but I know, according to Dr. Stephen Greer, they're getting closer. So if I'm right about this or if I'm wrong, I need you guys to do me a favor. Remember this speech in 2020. And I need you to, at least with an open mind, just for whenever you get a minute out of your day, to look into Dr. Stephen Greer and his work, and watch his documentaries on Netflix, Unacknowledged and Sirius, S-I-R-I-U-S. And it'll explain everything that I'm telling you. And it goes into more depth, and I have more documents, but I can pass them around if you guys like, but we're out of time and kind of, But overall, just take the chance to learn about this, because if this is all true stuff, and they're coming from high-ranking people, and this guy briefed Clinton. I know it sounds like just another speech in your classroom, but I took the opportunity to talk about a persuasive speech because this is the most persuasive topic that I know. So, with that being said, thank you for your time and appreciate it.